Welcome to the Selling Show, where we unpack, repack, and break down exactly how CEOs, founders, and senior executives sell their ideas, point of view, and personal brand to the people who matter most. This is your host, David Newman, and you are in the right place if you want to build market eminence, amplify your influence, and attract high-value prospects, investors, partners, talent, and media opportunities with less chasing and more confidence. Let's go. Podcasts. Do you listen to podcasts? Wait a minute, that's a stupid question. You're listening to one right now. But have you thought about hosting a podcast? Have you thought about what podcast hosting or podcast guesting might do for you and your brand and your market eminence? Well, I have the guest for you, Mr. John Goehring. Welcome to the show.
David, it's an honor to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
So besides your mellifluous pipes that people are already enjoying, tell us a little bit about the professional backstory of what brought you to the work that you're doing today, and what were some interesting side trips along the way.
Well, podcasting is that's my passion. It's where I reside mostly today. But where it started was full-time radio. AM, FM radio. You probably have one in your car. You may never actually turn it on, but you have one if you want it. And I worked in college radio, stepping into that college radio station. My first day on campus at a local small college here was life-changing for me because I fell in love with it immediately. Always wanted to be a writer, always wanted to communicate, and then finding my actual speaking voice was life-changing. So my road after that started in full-time radio professionally. A lot of things happened in radio, including a lot of layoffs, a lot of downsizing, a lot of big media conglomerates buying these stations, automating pretty much everything. And if you know anything about automation, which I know this has affected many industries, what's really ended up happening is the lack of as much need for people. So that's why I ended up going out on my own, doing the whole voiceover thing. I'll voice your 30-second spot for $50, you know, that kind of thing. And joining a world of a slew of other radio hosts who sound like a dime a dozen, because we all have this like real peppy, I'm going to sell you a car kind of voice, right? And that's when I ended up going towards podcasting, because I realized that that's not where we want to go. There's enough of those people out there. We really need the authentic voice, and whether it's voiceover or podcast production, that's what I try to bring now.
It's funny, I was just reading something. It was an article on Medium, and the topic was, and I'll send this to you just privately, like the millions of people listening, they're not going to get it. But it was something about, have business books jumped the shark? And it was talking, the first example is, why would you spend all this time and energy writing a business book when people consume podcasts so much more than they consume a business book? And the argument was, a podcast is evergreen, a podcast is ongoing. It's like, you buy a business book, you read the business book, maybe you're interested, you hire that guru, you bring that speaker into your organization, whatever. But once you finish that book, well, now they got to write another book. And now you got to wait another 2-3 years till that second book comes out. And a podcast is this ongoing beacon of your expertise. And it's an ongoing way to capture your participation in the marketplace and even owning part of the conversation in that marketplace. So the Medium article, just to summarize, is, why waste your time writing a business book that at most you'll, one a year, one every 2 years, whereas people are consuming this other method, namely podcasts, at such a tremendous rate, and there's so much more blue ocean available as a podcast host than as a business book author. So I'm just curious, just what's your response to that? What would you say has been your experience with the clients who you produce podcasts for?
Well, I would say there's still a place for books. And I know you do it marketing. You're doing a lot of that. You do a lot of work with that. And I know you had a guest on, Devin Sidesmore, earlier, who talks a lot about that. And there definitely is a place for books, especially when it comes to having a business card. But a podcast is such a powerful way to, like you said, that blue ocean that exists, that uncharted territory. And people will say, well, there's over 4 million podcasts or whatever out there. Well, the raw numbers are often manipulated a bit, because how many people have said, I'm going to start a podcast, and they get an RSS feed. If you don't know what that means, talk to me. I'd be happy to. I get nerdy about this stuff, right? They get an RSS feed and they dive in and they record an episode or two, and then, it doesn't do what they wanted it to do, or they give up too soon, or life gets in the way. They were never committed to begin with. Like 90+% of those 4 million podcasts are like that. How many podcasts like your podcast, David, and some of the podcasts that I get to edit, how many of those actually are functioning, serving as a powerful lead magnet at times, serving as a powerful information source for listeners, have over 10 reviews on Apple Podcasts? I know you got over 100. So there definitely is an uncharted ocean of territory. It just takes some time to grow, but it's incredibly rewarding.
I think, and you probably know the stats better than I do, but there's over 1 billion websites. And you mentioned there's 4 million podcasts, and maybe 10% of those are active. So call it 400,000 podcasts, which may even be high. I'm not sure. But someone said to me, there's 1 billion websites. Imagine if you built a website when there was only 400,000 websites in the world. Today, there's over 1 billion, but imagine if you were there early. You were there like in the early 1990s, 95, 96. I think Amazon's first website, Amazon.com, was 1995 or so. But imagine if you were one of the pioneers. You had one of those first 400,000 websites. People go, oh my God, that'd be great. That'd be amazing. That would be a huge opportunity. It's like, well, my friends, there's 400,000 podcasts. So is now your time to get into podcasting? Or do you want to wait until there's 1 billion podcasts and then you're truly lost in the noise? So tell us a little bit, John, about someone comes to you, maybe one of our listeners, and says, I've been thinking about a podcast for a long, long time. I heard John on the show. John, talk to me. Tell me about, what do I need to get started? Should it be a solo podcast? Should it be an interview format podcast? What are some of the initial baby steps and the initial decisions that you walk your clients through?
Well, your podcast can evolve over time, and that's the beauty. People get so caught up with, well, I have to have all these answers. I have to have this $500 microphone. I have to have everything that you have, John, everything figured out, and I don't even have everything figured out. So that's not even true. That's right there is a facade. But the idea is that you have to have everything figured out before you hit record on your first episode. And I couldn't disagree more. If you think you have everything figured out before you hit record on your first episode, you are in for a really rocky ride. What I recommend is making sure you have your sound right. And that doesn't mean the fancy microphone yet. When it comes to sound, the most important thing is your room. That is the most important thing. You could have a very cheap microphone and a great sounding room, and you could sound decent. I mean, you may not make money in voiceover, narrating those 30-second spots, right? But you could sound decent enough to put together a podcast that sounds very professional and high quality. And that's all we want, right? People are looking for content over sound quality, but it is important. Sound quality is huge. And that's one of the things I talk about a lot with podcasters before they start up their podcast is, how's your sound quality? How can we improve your sound quality without investing a ridiculous amount of money? Because podcasters don't want to do that, right? They haven't got any return on their investment yet in doing a podcast. They don't want to invest in that $500 microphone, and they don't need to. So that's the first step, is getting your sound right. Once you do that, I think the key is to niche down as much as possible. If you do this, David, you're not just, one of those dime a dozen shows that talks about like literally anything. I've been on podcasts before, and they're like, yeah, we like to talk about everything, just whatever comes to mind that day. I'm like, well, how do your listeners feel about that? It's really important to grow an audience, to fill a specific niche. And sometimes we think that that's narrowing ourselves or limiting our potential, but it's actually maximizing it. So finding that niche, whatever it is. I know a very successful podcaster who works with paintless dent repair techs and who literally just talks about the art of paintless dent repair. It's an auto repair technique. Yeah. It's one very niche market, but that podcast is very successful. And not only is the podcast reach wide, the important thing is that you're reaching the people that you want to talk to, especially if you're doing a podcast for your business. So those are the first two things for me: get your sound quality right, and then niche down as narrow as possible.
Hey now, what a great episode, right? Are you ready to build your own Market Eminence game plan using the power of speaking, publishing, and podcasting? Book a chat with me to build your plan and see if and how I might help you further. The link is doitmarketing.com/call. No sales team, no pressure, no goofballs, just you and me having a CEO to CEO chat about what's possible for you and your company. Hop on with me, doitmarketing.com/call. And now, let's jump right back into the interview. I want to talk about a podcast as a business development asset. So you mentioned sometimes we publish a business book as a business card, a podcast. And it's funny, my friend Lou Diamond, who I was on his show, I had him on here. He drew the following distinction, and I'm wondering kind of what your experience and recommendations are. He says, when I'm hosting a show, I typically don't get leads for my speaking. I get leads for consulting. When I'm a guest on someone else's show, I almost always get leads as a speaker. Hey, can you come to our event? Hey, we'd love to have this topic. And it's very interesting I get this kind of lead gen when I'm hosting, and I get a different kind of lead gen when I'm guesting. So I'm curious, John, what's your advice, or what criteria should we have in mind when we're looking at a business outcome for a podcast?
Well, I think the number one thing is that niching, and that's so important. Now, it makes sense, David, about being a guest on a podcast being really a public speaking opportunity, right? And yes, so is hosting to an extent, right? But when you host a podcast, you now are building more than just a podcast, but you're building a community, and that is the key. And the more niche down you are in the community, the better. And just like anything in business, right? The niches are where the riches are, or whatever. You probably heard that, right? That's huge in any form of sales and marketing, right? So that's, to me, a podcast is the best type of business development tool because it's getting your name out there. It's content marketing, which is such a big term now, right? I'm so overwhelmed. How do I create so much content and make it work for my brand? Well, how about a podcast? Because with a podcast, sure, you have the RSS feed, and now you're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and whatever. That's great. But if you do what we're doing now and you record the video, you can take 10 to 15 short podcast clips from it. There's 10 to 15 videos or YouTube shorts or TikToks or whatever you want to do with it. You can put it into a transcript and edit it a little bit and turn it into a blog post. You can turn it into a LinkedIn post. You can repurpose so much with a podcast. And that's the beauty. It can serve as really your entire content marketing strategy. So between that and then also having guests on, building those relationships. You asked earlier, should you do a solo show or a guest show? Solo shows are nice, and there's benefits to those because you position yourself as the expert. But guests, I think, are in most industries are even more valuable because of the connections that you can make through having a guest on your podcast. So I think a combination of both is nice. I like to recommend if you're doing a weekly show, maybe once monthly, having a solo episode, and then the other times having guests on. But it really depends. But overall, to answer your question, it is a huge lead gen tool.
I would love you to promote some of your clients' podcasts, because I think people are not aware of the breadth and the depth and how many different kinds of businesses and experts can benefit from podcasting. You gave a great example of the paintless dent repair. And it's like, people like, really? There's a paintless dent repair podcast? So my friends, there's podcasts for everything, but let's showcase some of your fantastic clients too. What are some of their topics and shows?
Well, I love it because when I edit podcasts, I'm also learning by listening to the podcasts and doing my job and editing them. I work with a gentleman named Jake Stahl, and he does a phenomenal podcast called Lead Gen Reboot. And the entire purpose of the podcast, you want to talk niche and narrow, is not only is he promoting his consulting brand and the AI tool that he's built, but what he's done is he's really focused on this area of automated reach outs. And how many of those do we get on LinkedIn? Oh my goodness, how relatable is this to like anybody who's on LinkedIn or even just has an email address, right? And his whole point about this is that maybe 10 valuable conversations are better than 10,000 cold emails. And he works through some of the alternatives to this automated reach out and this like quantity over quality numbers game type thing. And that's like the entire podcast. And that's such a beautiful thing to me, because it's like, how many times can you have a similar conversation, but yet bring different value to it every time? So that's the podcast I love working with. And then I work with a marketing professional named Christy Mitchell, who does a podcast called Unfudge Your Marketing. And it's just a really fun podcast, as the title suggests, right? And so it's a combination of really valuable information, but also fun. And people are so uptight when they're podcasting and think, well, I have to put on my best professional self, right? If your brand is laughter, have some fun with podcasting. Explicit podcasts are listened to just as much as unexplicit podcasts. It's actually a podcast statistic that has been proven. So have some fun if that's your brand. Those two podcasts especially come to mind. I love working with them.
So I love the term unfudge. Like, does she really mean unfudge, or is there a similar word that we're really trying to get to here?
Yes, and that way it doesn't even have to be put in the explicit category. So
That's right.
It's nice.
But does she actually drop the F-bomb during the shows?
No, she keeps it clean. And you know, okay, she's a mom of, you know, elementary school aged kids and everything. So it's probably just habit, right? But yes. I listening to her, I'm like, how can you keep it so clean yet have that humorous angle too?
That is great. I'm curious, John, as a producer, what are some of your favorite AI tools? You mentioned things like chopping up a big video into small snippets. You talked about transcribing into written content. These days, I know there's an overwhelming number of AI tools. What are some of your favorites for podcasting specifically?
Well, I've used 3 video related ones, and I'm on my 3rd, which I like the best, but they were all sufficient. There's one called Video AI. I think it's VIDYO. And that was good for creating some clips and auto subtitling, those kinds of things. Then I went to Opus AI, which is OPUS, which is good for the same thing. And then I kind of landed, because it's a more robust video production tool in general, on a service called Veed, VEED. It's another AI tool that does a great job for podcasts, cutting it up into short clips. It'll actually, probably with an hour long recording or so, will give you 20 to 30 clips, and most of them will be usable. And it'll put on those subtitles for you. And obviously you gotta edit it. AI is not a set it and forget it type thing. We're not there yet. We may never get there. I don't know, but that human element is so important, right? You're gonna have to be careful when you're using those AI tools. And then one that I use for transcribing is called Restream, which is a great transcriber, because, and I'm sure there's other, maybe even free ones out there that do the same thing, but getting a podcast transcription is huge once you've recorded a show, because that'll help you make show notes. It'll help you pull quotes. It might even help you, if you prefer to edit this way, pull out some clips in the show to make a nice teaser or a hook or a trailer, as some people call it. If you'd rather read through, that's usually easier to read a transcript and find a time-stamped clip than to listen to the whole thing back again. So those tools I love, though, like you said, David, there's new ones coming out every day. It's ridiculous.
I'm curious, as far as lead gen from a podcast. I know in the old days, and this probably still works, they would say, okay, publish your podcast episode, promote the podcast episode, and then have content upgrades. Content upgrades might come from the host. Content upgrades might come from the guest. Hey, to get John's special super duper PDF, go to, the sellingshow.com/whatever. And so now the podcast host is generating leads. That's one old school piece of advice. Another piece of old school advice, I want to kind of validate these with you, see if any of these are still relevant, is have a private forum, whether it's on School or Kajabi or Facebook or Circle, all these community platforms. Have a private community just for your podcast listeners and post bonus content in the community. Are any of those relevant today? Do you see your clients gravitating towards this? Or what are some ways to extract some lead generation juice from your listener base?
The podcast community, I think, is a brilliant idea. And a gentleman I work with actually does a podcast newsletter, which is similar, right? Although maybe even putting it as part of a Facebook group or something like that might even be better because of the more two-way interaction that can go on. But turning your podcast into a different medium too, where it's not just you're reaching the people who happen to tune in that week, but also actually reaching their inbox. And once you've built that trust and it's an opt-in newsletter, you're not just ambushing them with emails all the time. And please, no more than once a week. Ideally, is you're putting out an episode and you may have an email for that episode, but no more than once a week. I also say no more than one salesy call to action once a month is what I recommend. But that's, you're probably more the expert on that, right? But I would still say that that's powerful. Anything, because podcasters will sometimes, or aspiring podcasters will come to me and say, well, I really want to make this a new revenue stream. I really want to make this, I want to either run ads or I want to create a community that is a fee-based community. And I think early on, it's best to stay away from that because you simply haven't built the content library or the trust. Later on down the road, maybe, but the facts are, unfortunately, for a lot of us, there is so much free content out there that it's really hard to justify. It better be really, really valuable if you're going to get people to actually pay for your content. So the best approach I've found is continue to nurture your leads through constant communication with your podcast, and then actually provide save the actual monetized part for your business and for actually providing the service that you provide.
Wait. We're not just going to listen to this episode. There are downloads, there are resources, there are links, there are bonuses waiting for you on this episode's page when you go over to doitmarketing.com/podcast. That's right, doitmarketing.com/podcast. Grab the notes right under this episode. See you over there. Let me ask you this, and this may be a new trend or an anti-trend. I was talking to someone about lead magnets, lead capture, opt-ins. What he said to me is, what the real pros are doing. And I'm always like, okay, so did you just call me not a real pro? Anyway, what the real pros are doing now, David, is ungated content. Just put it out there and you will be in the top 10% because everyone else is looking at this transactional. Hey, give me your email address and I'll give you a thing, or give me your email address and I'll send you a whole bunch of things, as opposed to, hey, you know what? I'm just gonna put this out there. You're smart, so give people credit for having a brain, right? So when I'm on a podcast now, we have a special URL for people that, hear me on a podcast. It's doitmarketing.com/hello. And there is no email capture. And there's a ton of resources up there. So there's PDFs, there's videos, there's webinars, there's podcast episodes that I've been on, there's ebook downloads, and there is it's like this free wonderland. And so this new way of thinking, 2025 and beyond, is give people credit for being smart if they have a need, they know that something is for sale, they know that you're running a commercial business, they can find you, they can email you, they can fill out your little contact form and say, hey, David, I've gotten so much value from you. I think I need your help. Tell us a little bit about what are the pros and cons to gated versus ungated, and what would your advice be to emerging podcast hosts?
It's a great question. And to boil it down into simple terms, because it ultimately depends on where you are in your journey. If nobody knows you from a bag of beans, you got to gate your content, I believe.
Yes.
How else are you going to capture email addresses?
Yeah.
That is, to me, a way that I've been able to get business is through my email list. It's a way that I've been able to foster genuine relationships. As long as, you actually reply to the replies to your email list and you're actually active, you're building this community. But nobody's gonna, I don't think if you just put out great content, I don't think the 5 people who hit your website are going to all reach out to you and tell you how great your content is. Now, with that said, if you're further along in the journey, like you are, David, like I know so many others are who are listening to your show, if you're further along in that journey and you already have a 1,000+ subscriber email list, maybe you don't need to build those relationships. You don't need necessarily to do the same things you were doing when you were starting out. Then ungated content can be valuable because then you're just continuing to add value and you're just continuing to do that. I think that you constantly need to put out content, no matter if you're just starting out or if you're further along in the process. I think whether or not it's gated really depends on where you are in that process. Early on, I say gate it. Get those email addresses. You got to start somewhere, right? Later on, I could see where that perspective comes from, because certainly you want to give people credit for, like you said, having a brain.
I totally agree. This is completely dependent on the stage and phase of the business that you're at and what your immediate goals are. So, if someone said to me 20 years ago, hey, David, have some ungated content or have all ungated content, right? That's another thing. Are we talking about all or nothing? Are we talking about a few pieces, a few premium pieces are gated, and then you have your commodity stuff? So let's say you have your YouTube channel. Generally speaking, your YouTube channel is ungated anyway. What would be the harm of having a page on your website that maybe podcast people can access, and it's just a whole bunch of YouTube embeds? Those YouTubes aren't generating leads when they're on YouTube, so they don't need to generate leads when they're on your website. But if I hadn't built a list of 25, 30, 35,000 names, I would not be sitting here going, I'm going to have ungated content. Because You're right, the money is in your email list. And people have heard this a lot, but it never hurts to hear it again. Don't build your house on rented land. So if you have a huge following on LinkedIn, you don't own LinkedIn. You have a huge following, you have an enormous Facebook group, you don't own that Facebook group. The only thing that you can really own is your email list. And so that becomes the lifeblood of your business if you're in stage 1, stage 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Once you're at stage 10, sure, make these different decisions or experiment and see what works and see if people come to you through the ungated channels as well as the gated channels. So that is really smart advice to kind of figure out where are you in the evolution of your business and what is your immediate goal with your podcast. Talk to us, John, a little bit about the role that you recommend for your podcast hosts. How much should they focus on podcast guesting?
Well, again, it's going to depend on where you are in your journey and your industry. I would say it's a huge, huge opportunity to market your podcast and yourself. Podcasters love podcasters, right? Yes. I mean, that's one of the reasons we hit it off early on is like, oh, you host podcasts, you edit podcasts, great. Oh, you host a great podcast too. That's something that I think can help build relationships. It can also help you practice. Becoming a podcast guest, you got to put in the reps. You're becoming a public speaker, right? And that's one way, even though hosting and guesting are so different, that's one way to get yourself comfortable. And then maybe even the biggest benefit is understanding podcasting from the other side.
Yeah.
As a host, you don't really quite get what your guest is going through. Maybe your guest has been a guest on 100 other shows. Each show was a different experience.
Yeah.
It wasn't always exactly the same. One of them they use Zoom, one of them they use Riverside. One of them the host wouldn't shut up and kept talking, and you're like, why am I even here? Right? There's a lot of different experiences you can have, and by being a guest, you can better understand what your guests are feeling when they come on your show. And I think a guest makes you a better host. I would say, David. I mean, you've been a guest on podcasts yourself. Would you say the same thing?
Oh, I totally agree, for sure. I want to ask you about when you're hosting, there are shows that have a very rigid format and that, here's the 10 questions I ask every guest. And, at the end, I'm going to say, give me your 2 favorite books and, who was your biggest influence and so forth. And then there's shows like mine where it's just free form. I mean, we have a topic, we have a theme, obviously. I have a way of interviewing people, but my ethos on this show is that the best episodes sound like a coffee chat between friends, or you're a fly on the wall, and you're overhearing the coffee chat between friends. With the shows that you produce, John, what is your recommendation, maybe for the newer host? Scripted, unscripted, set questions, not set questions. What's your advice when they ask you stuff like that?
The beginning and the end, I believe, are the parts that should be scripted. Everything else, no. I hate shows that have set questions that are the same for every single guest. I will not listen to them. I will not produce them unless you're open to feedback and maybe willing to compromise in that regard.
Yeah.
With that said, preparation is key in podcasting. People say, well, how can I prepare and not prepare by getting to know your guest? Yeah. How would you prepare for a coffee chat with somebody? Would you write down 10 questions that you're going to ask them? Maybe, but probably not. Get to know them. Find other podcasts they've been on. That's probably the best way for a podcast host to prepare for a guest is search somebody's name, try to find a podcast they've been on. David's on my show. Oh, I'm David Newman. I want to see other podcasts that he's been on. What does he sound like? What questions really resonate with him? What should the host probably have stayed away from? That's the best way. Now, with that said, I think it's important to know what your first question is right off the bat. Know how you want to start the conversation.
Yeah.
Just like in any other conversation, you do your intro that is somewhat scripted. Eventually you get to the point where maybe it's not so scripted, but you still kind of know where you're going. You're not just turning on the mic and going, well, hello, everybody. No, you don't want that, right? You want a scripted, at least a beginning that you know where it's going. Begin with the end in mind, right? And then so you know that first question, then you know the end too. One thing that a lot of podcasts do that I think is really cool is they have the same question at the end for every guest. Yeah. One more. Here's my last question for you. I ask this to every guest. For example, one podcast that I'm a big fan of and do some work with will ask if you could teach one course that is not normally offered in, the traditional educational setting, what would it be? And guests come up with all sorts of different answers. That's part of that podcast's brand. Yes. So that's okay to me, but scripted questions, not a fan of them. I like the way you format your podcast.
Now, it's funny. This is very similar to what advice people get when they're preparing a presentation or a speech or a TEDx talk is first 30 seconds, totally tight, totally scripted. Last 30 seconds, right? The big finish, stick the landing, totally tight, totally scripted. Everything else should sound like a spontaneous conversation. Yes, you have slides. Yes, you have points. Yes, you have things that you're going through when you're doing a on-stage or virtual presentation. But the first 30 seconds, that's the first impression that either gets people to pay attention or go back to scrolling on their phones. And then the last 30 seconds is, that's where you get to pull on the heartstrings or have an emotional close or a big, powerful reminder that sticks the landing. Everything else, if it's memorized, you're dead. You're just dead because it sucks the life out of that presentation. Just like I agree with you. And, we could find people who vehemently oppose what we're about to say. Scripted preset questions for every guest, I think, tends to squeeze the spontaneity out of the conversation. And the cool thing is you never know where that conversation is going to go if you're actually listening to the answers that you get.
Yeah.
We are in total agreement with that. As we're landing the plane here, I'm going to ask you my two final questions because I have two final questions also. The final question is, where can people get connected and stay connected to more John Goehring brilliance? But the question before that is, if people were to take one overarching idea from our conversation today, what would you hope that big idea or big takeaway would be?
I hope they would consider starting a podcast and consider that being the content marketing engine of their brand. If you are listening and maybe podcasting sounds intimidating, it sounds, well, David Newman and the Selling Show, he's on every single, this is like, he's got a however many reviews up on Apple Podcasts and everything. That doesn't have to be what podcasting is, at least to start out. First podcast episode, it's going to suck. Second one, it's going to suck. Maybe 1% less than the first one. It's going to take maybe up to 6 months to a year of consistent weekly podcasting to get where you need to be. But even during the suck, you're going to have content to post. You're going to suck for 80% of it, but that 20% you can pull out and post. And people aren't going to find you right away on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and listen to every single one of your episodes, except maybe your mom. And that's great because she thinks everything you do is amazing, right? So the people who matter are going to see those cherry-picked short clips that you take out of that podcast. And if you do it right, it can be a great content marketing engine. So just consider if you're not ready to take that leap. Understandable. There are people doing their own great content out there that maybe, okay, well, I'm already doing this content, so starting a podcast, not ready for that. Fine. How about consider guesting on podcasts to start and just see where that leads you? And I think that's just a powerful way. Just really respect the medium of podcasting as the future. I would say it's also the present. I teach a class of 50 college students, and one of the first things I ask them all the time, just out of my own curiosity, how many of you guys listen to the radio? One girl raises her hand because her dad works at a radio station. How many of you listen to podcasts? Every single one of those 50 hands goes up. This is Gen Z. This is 18, 19-year-old kids who were born in 2007, for crying out loud. And that's a scary stat. But these people are listening to podcasts. This is the future. This is really what you should be getting in on now.
Amen, brother. I could not agree more. Well, I know people are going to want to get connected and stay connected to more John Goehring brilliance. Where can we send people? What links should go in the show notes? JonathanGoehring.com is really the one-stop shop for all things. That's where the voiceover and the audio production content goes. JonathanGoehring.com. I know the spelling's a little funky, so the link is down there in the show notes, but you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter up there where I share some tips on improving your audio. That's the other thing that's huge for podcasters, is when you start off, maybe you have okay audio, but as you go along without investing huge amounts of money, there are ways to improve your audio quality. And then also the Sound Insights newsletter up on LinkedIn is something that I've really enjoyed doing. I post a new newsletter weekly there every Thursday, and I'm really active on LinkedIn and enjoy the platform. Excellent. So we will drop links to all of those wonderful goodies directly below this episode at thesellingshow.com. John Goehring, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for stopping by.
David, thank you for having me on today.
And that wraps up another episode of The Selling Show. Hey, tell you what, if you like us, rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, tell a friend, go grab the notes and downloads and extras at thesellingshow.com. See you next time.